ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
How did the internet go from being a fun place to hang out to a twisted mess full of racism and misinformation?
The fact-checkers have just been too politically biased and have destroyed more trust than they've created, especially in the US.
It feels like we're on a path of no return, but our government is fighting back. From If You're Listening, this is Australia versus the internet. I'm Matt Bevan. Find it on the ABC Listen app.
I can't see how the coalition gets into government from the numbers we're seeing at the moment. Therefore, the coalition can't form government. Therefore, Labor will form government in the next parliament.
This is a win for the ages if it happens as we're expecting. He has pulled off one of the great political victories since Federation.
Earlier on, I called the Prime Minister to congratulate him on his success tonight. It's an historic occasion for the Labor Party and we recognise that.
It was a defeat of a magnitude few expected. Anthony Albanese has become the first Prime Minister to win re-election in more than 20 years, leaving the Liberals gutted and their leader kicked out of Parliament.
Today, the Australian people have voted for Australian values, for fairness, aspiration and opportunity for all. For the strength to show courage in adversity and kindness to those in need.
Today, political editor for the ABC's 7:30 program, Laura Tingle, on the landslide result and how it will change the political landscape for a long time to come. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal Land in Sydney. This is ABC News Day. Laura, what an extraordinary result. There's really no other word for it, is there?
No, it's absolutely extraordinary, Sam. I don't think anybody picked it, and of course all sorts of things are now going to be read into it, or lots of factors will be ascribed to the result, but just an absolutely comprehensive result that, will change the landscape of our politics, I think, for some time to come.
And that the swing was so clear so early on. What was going through your mind when these results started coming in?
Well, there had been this view that there could be a real disparity within the groups of votes, the people who'd voted on the day, the people who'd been undecided and were very detached from politics and all those things. And, traditionally there's always been this sort of skew to the coalition in pre-polling. But I was always presuming that there'd be at least a minority government and quite likely a majority. But the thing that was extraordinary was in the seats where it was coming up, and coming up so early were things that weren't even on the radar. I actually texted somebody at just after 7 o'clock and I said, this isn't going to be close.
No.
But, you have to maintain some caution because you almost can't believe it.
So, Anthony Albanese, he was on his feet just 4 hours after polls had closed. He was joined, of course, by his son Nathan and his fiancée Jodie Hayden.
My fellow Australians, serving as your Prime Minister is the greatest honour of my life.
What were the biggest takeaways from that speech, do you think?
I suppose the thing that's sort of interesting to me about the Prime Minister is he's sort of lifted a few levels in the last few months as a sort of a leader who can talk. And talking was never necessarily his finest attribute. And it was a really gracious speech. People started to sort of boo when he mentioned Peter Dutton. He said, no, that's not what we do.
No. What we do in Australia is we treat people with respect. I thanked Peter for his generous words at the end of what has been a very hard-fought campaign.
I think the thing that it came through to me was all of those messages about being a Prime Minister for the centre, about being slow and steady, if you like, not being a radical. People would sort of mock him for that in the first term and just sort of say, well, that's an excuse for being gutless. Now, It may well be, but the point was that's what people wanted. The polls would suggest that when they had a good look at Peter Dutton, they didn't like him and they didn't like what he was offering, and it made them nervous. So in that sense, Anthony Albanese sort of embraced and is the figure for that time. And I think the speech reflected that. It was all about, unity and doing things together and all those sorts of things, which can sound a bit naff, let's be perfectly honest, but I think that's what voters want to hear.
But now that the Australian people have made their clear choice, let us all reflect on what we have in common. Because no matter who you voted for, no matter where you live, no matter how you worship or who you love,
and I think it's reassuring to voters to hear him talk in those terms. And so I thought that speech reflected the result.
We are all Australians.
And for Labor to unseat Peter Dutton after more than 2 decades in Parliament, everyone seemed to have dismissed this idea before polling day that Dutton could lose his own seat. Or not everyone?
Well, I didn't, because people would say to you, look, it's always been close and he's always fought back. But that overlooked the fact that the margin this time was only 1.7%. It was one of the most marginal seats in the country. And the Labor candidate, who will now be the new MP, Ali France, had a couple of goes at him before, so really, knew what she was doing by this stage.
Back in 2018, I was told that Dixon was not winnable and it wouldn't be winnable until Peter Dutton retired. I took all of that in and went, nah.
So it didn't take that much to unseat him, so I always thought that the possibility that both he and Keith Wallahan in Victoria, who was sort of seen as, a future leader, were in pretty big trouble, and that proved to be the case. So it was more the rest of the result that, really shocked me, and the extent of the swing that they faced.
Yeah. And what did you make then, Laura, of Peter Dutton's concession speech?
Look, I thought it was a very gracious speech, a tough speech to give, but it was a gracious speech. He didn't shirk responsibility as some leaders have been known to do. He took it on the chin.
It's not our night, as I point out, and there are good members, good candidates who have lost their seats or their ambition, and I'm sorry for that. We have an amazing party and we'll rebuild.
All right, but he can't escape the fact that regardless of how long he was in Parliament for, he has led the coalition to a quite frankly dreadful loss, one that will be really hard to come back from in 3 years' time, I would think.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the coalition is really reduced to a rump, both in parliamentary numbers. I mean, we saw last time the coalition getting wiped out in Western Australia, and that has these knock-on effects for the organisation. I mean, it's very hard to raise money. You don't have the organisational strength behind you to sort of organise campaigns. And we've now got this quite shocking situation where there are no coalition people in Hobart, Adelaide or Melbourne. There are only a couple in Sydney and a couple in Brisbane. So it's been largely wiped out of our major cities as a party. There's nothing that says that any political party lives on indefinitely. And given that the membership base of the Liberal Party is so old that it doesn't have any real grip on the cities anymore, and it's down to a really small group in Parliament, won't have the numbers in the Senate, parties do come back, but I don't see how this happens anytime soon, because I think what's happened as a result of this election is they're left without a philosophy, realistically. It's not clear what their philosophy is, what they stand for, or even a policy base. I mean, it's not just that a few policies were rejected, but their entire political strategy has been rejected too, I think.
Yeah, all right. Well, let's just come back to what it means for the Liberal and National parties in a moment, Laura. But I wanted to discuss with you first what on earth happened, because we were told, I guess, that the cost of living was the biggest issue in voters' minds going into this poll. So did voters simply think they'd be better off under Labor, Or is it more complex than that?
Well, I think there were a few things. I mean, the coalition rightly said the cost of living is the issue, and the government was also saying, yeah, the cost of living is the issue. But having done that, the coalition not only sort of engaged in all of this extracurricular stuff, as people talk about the culture wars, but they also didn't actually have any policies that substantively either addressed the cost of living, other than a 25% cut in petrol prices for 12 months, or offer any significant difference in economic policy settings to improve people's standards of living. They asserted that the economy would grow more strongly under a coalition, that inflation would be lower, and offered not one single policy that materially changed the way the economy would operate. And I think people saw through that. Whereas the Labor Party basically made Medicare the sort of meme, if you like, of the sorts of things that a Labor government would do for people to make life better. Now, it's not necessarily the case that people will think that they will be better off under a Labor government necessarily, but they certainly were not convinced that whatever the coalition would do would make it better for them. Particularly at a period of uncertainty, they just went, well, yeah, nah, let's just stick with what we've got.
And Australians aren't Americans, right? So you can't sound like Trump on some things and expect it to go down like it did in America, for instance, slashing the public service.
No, they don't necessarily work here. And, you know, we're a smaller place. Things like saying, oh, we're going to sack 41,000 public servants is more complicated here. One, because we're a smaller population, and so most people do know somebody who work in the public service. And I think too, given the record of the coalition, you know, with things like robo-debt, like Veterans Affairs, people materially understand that anybody who's had to deal with Centrelink and faced long queues because it's understaffed, people know what that means. And so it doesn't necessarily tick the box that the coalition thinks it will, I think.
All right. Well, Laura, let's now turn to what really changes now a Labor government has been returned to office. Anthony Albanese didn't go into this election with any really big ticket items, did he? There was no policy like The Voice, you know, the referendum that he took to the election in 2022. He was a pretty small target, wasn't he?
Well, he didn't have any big sort of social policy issues, certainly, like sort of a totemic issue like The Voice. But, you know, there was a whole range of things which are a combination of what they've done already and where they're heading next, you know, which are basically all just sort of incrementally building on things, you know, and childcare is the issue that the PM sort of said was the biggest change that he'd produced. Now, they've boosted the wages of childcare workers, they've boosted the subsidies to the childcare system, they're aiming to make it universal. The sorts of things that they're going to be looking at are really issues about the sorts of services and care that people in the community get. It's folly to think that they cannot address a whole range of issues that are coming at us and them. Obviously, we're going to have to rewire ourselves for Trump world, and that means absolutely massive challenges to the way we interact with the rest of the world, to the defence debate. You know, if you go back to the Prime Minister's speech, it is about the national interest rather than self-interest. And I think since the days of the resources boom and John Howard's big tax cuts, basically giving people stuff without any obligations for them to do anything, to lose anything, has been the order of the day. And the great challenge for the Prime Minister and his team will be that we're not going to be able to keep doing that. We just don't have the money to keep doing that. So he's going to have to find a way of gradually changing that. So that might mean that instead of things being universal, we're going to have to go back to, as a starting point, means testing. We're going to have to do something about the tax system. There are all those big issues which are coming at Labor, whether they are on the platform or not.
All right, well, Peter Dutton, of course, is gone, so there'll be a lot of soul-searching for the coalition. Has the party become irrelevant, do you think, in the mind of voters, and how do they fix that?
Well, I don't think it's irrelevant in the sense that Conservative voters want to have somebody who will represent them and be successful. And, you know, a lot of them are really, really outraged that they were not given that chance at this election, that they didn't have a viable alternative option to vote for. I mean, the number of people who said to me, we don't believe in these policies that were being put forward. There will always be a call for a conservative party, not a radical far-right party, but for an economically drier party. Whether the Liberal and National parties and the LNP in Queensland are in a fit state to do that or not is a really open question, I think, because it has been so ground down over such a long period of time.
What about nuclear policy? Does that survive, do you think?
No.
Is that dead and buried now?
No. I mean, let's remember what the nuclear policy was, as Matt Canavan so pragmatically put it. It was a political fix so they didn't have to answer the net zero question. Nobody ever really believed in it. It doesn't make any immediate sense. And while the interests of the energy sector as big donors to the coalition remain, I think that it's not just the parliamentary party that's going to have to change, but if you think about the way Peter Dutton alienated the gas sector with his gas reservation policy, all of those connections are going to have to really rethink where they think energy policy is, in a self-interested way and in a national interest way.
So I gather then getting the next leader right is rather important at this point. Who do you think will be victorious?
I wouldn't even hazard a guess there, Sam. I mean, there's this field of people, who's been mentioned, Dan Tehan, Susan Lee, Angus Taylor. They've all got a fairly large amount of lead in their saddlebags. None of them sort of strike me as obvious choices for leadership.
All right. Well, on ABC TV last night, Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, said this is just really the beginning for Anthony Albanese. Do you think he'll be around for a while yet, here to contest the next election as well? Labor will be in an incredibly powerful position going into the next election, won't it?
It will. It's basically there for Anthony Albanese to choose his own destiny at this point. Any re-election win gives the Prime Minister of the day extraordinary authority, but this one gives Anthony Albanese immense authority, put into the Labor pantheon, as they say. So it's up to him to decide what he wants to do. And I think you'd have to presume that having had such an extraordinary win, he will want to just absolutely go for it and make the most of it.
All right. Well, Laura, the electorate has emphatically endorsed the Prime Minister and Labor, but it doesn't mean that they're not jaded. Things have been really, really tough for a lot of Australians over the past few years. Will they expect that this Labor government will make things better for them over the next 3 years?
Look, I think everybody always hopes that a government can make things better, but pragmatically, most voters know that there's not that much governments can do to, make things better. They just hope that it doesn't make them worse. I think most voters will be quite surprised by the result. I think it's still the case that voters are sort of a bit ambivalent about the Albanese government, but what we saw in 1993 when we saw Paul Keating win that unwinnable election was once he won it, there was this enormous sort of outpouring of goodwill towards him and the government because they went, this is good, we like this. But they blew it. The government blew it. There was hubris. They did go off onto issues which people didn't think were about them, like the Republic. That's always the killer for a government. Voters want to know that, even if governments are stuffing up a bit, what drives them is fixing things for the voters, not for themselves. That will be, I think, the big test that voters have.
Laura Tingle is the political editor for the ABC's 7:30 program on ABC TV, Monday to Thursday. You can also catch it on iView. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.